In the late 1980s, the Menendez family lived in a sprawling Beverly Hills mansion that epitomized success and wealth. Joe Menendez, a self-made entertainment executive, provided his wife Kitty and their sons Lyle and Erik with every material comfort money could buy. To outsiders, they were the picture of the American dream, privileged, good-looking, and prosperous. Yet behind the mansion's ornate doors, a very different story was unfolding. The family's private world was one of intense pressure, emotional turmoil, and secrets that would fester into tragedy. Joe's was a domineering patriarch who demanded absolute perfection from his sons. He had exceedingly high expectations and was known to dole out severe emotional abuse when those expectations were not met. Biography. Lyle, the eldest, born in 1968, and Erik, born in 1970, grew up in constant fear of disappointing their father. Kitty, their mother, struggled with her own demons. By the late 1980s, she was battling alcoholism and depression, described by those who knew her as a broken wife and useless mother. In the throes of her husband's infidelities. Biography. The household atmosphere was tense and volatile. Open communication about feelings was virtually non-existent. Instead, resentments and pain were suppressed beneath a strict facade of family prestige. Behind the luxurious veneer, Lyle and Erik were internalizing years of fear and hurt. They learned to wear masks, smiling in family photos and at country club gatherings, while hiding the anxiety that lived in their hearts. Both boys excelled in outward endeavors. Erik was a talented tennis player. Lyle attended Princeton briefly, yet inside they were emotionally adrift. In this home, vulnerability was a danger and obedience was survival. The normal rebellions or cries for help of adolescence were smothered by a code of silence and denial. Unbeknownst to the world, and even to close relatives, the Menendez mansion was a pressure cooker, and its gauge was inching toward the red. It has been said that our past cannot and does not take away our present freedom of choice to choose how we will react and live. Members. Cogwa.org. But the Menendez family had seemingly lost that freedom in a cycle of control and fear. No one involved, not Joe's with his iron fist, not Kitty in her despondence, nor Lyle and Erik in their traumatized silence, found the courage or clarity to break the pattern. As the summer of 1989 arrived, the emotional storm within this family was reaching a breaking point. The stage was set for an unthinkable act that would shatter their lives and horrify the nation, proving tragically how trauma and unchecked emotion can escalate into irreversible outcomes. Chapter 2: The Breaking Point. August 20, 1989. A humid Sunday night in late August 1989, meant to be an ordinary end to a summer weekend, instead became the night of reckoning. Inside the Menendez mansion on Elm Drive, Joe and Kitty settled in the den to watch a movie together. It was just after 10 p.m. The house was quiet, save for the low murmur of the television. Joe relaxed on a couch, and Kitty curled up beside him, unaware that their two sons were silently preparing to execute a deadly plan born of desperation and rage. Fox News. Lyle, 21, and Erik, 18, had armed themselves with 12-gauge shotguns and Wikipedia.org. Adrenaline coursed through their veins. Years of fear, anger, and perceived helplessness were boiling over. As their parents engrossed themselves in the TV screen, the brothers crept into the room from behind. In a flash, thunderous gunfire erupted. They opened fire on their own mother and father from behind the couch. A barrage of shotgun blasts in quick succession. Fox News. Joe's was hit multiple times before he even had a chance to stand, his body torn by close-range shots. Kitty screamed and tried to run, but panic slowed her. The brothers pursued her as she slipped on the blood-slicked floor. They shot her in the leg, shattering bone, and as she fell, they reloaded their weapons with grim resolve. In a final volley, they shot their mother point blank, delivering the fatal wounds. The carnage was brutal and absolute. A bloody 1989 shotgun massacre in the Menendez living room. Fox News. In the span of just a few minutes, Joe and Kitty Menendez lay slumped and lifeless amid the wreckage of overturned furniture and spreading pools of blood. When the echo of gunfire ceased, an eerie silence fell over the home. The air was thick with the acrid smell of spent gunpowder. Lyle and Erik stood breathing heavily, shock and dread flooding in as the reality of what they had done set in. The boys who once trembled at their father's voice had become harbingers of death. The scene was one of unimaginable gore, walls pocked with pellet holes, the television still playing unwatched, and the two bodies that had given Lyle and Erik life, now grotesquely still. The brothers' hearts pounded with a chaotic mix of relief, horror, and disbelief. They had done the unthinkable. There was no going back. All the nightmares and fear that had built up over years had exploded outward. And in those moments of frenzied violence, they believed they had liberated themselves from their tormentor. But as the adrenaline ebbed, a new emotion seeped in, a primal fear of the consequences that would follow. That night, the Menendez brothers crossed an irreversible line. What had been done in seconds would carry repercussions for decades. In the philosophy of Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius wrote a caution that could serve as an epitaph for that moment. How much more harmful are the consequences of anger and grief than the circumstances that arouse them in us? Micropreneur. Life. The brothers' fury had been unleashed to destroy what ails, and whom they thought was the source of their pain. But in doing so, they set in motion even more grievous consequences. Indeed, the next steps they took would further illustrate how one tragedy begets another when we let fear and rage take the reins. Chapter 30c. Aftermath of a crime. Lyle and Erik now found themselves in the eye of the storm they had created. The immediate danger, their parents, was gone, but a new one emerged: exposure. In those first few minutes after the killings, the brothers made a fateful decision to cover up their involvement. They concocted a story to tell police, a fiction of unknown intruders and a home invasion. To make it believable, they needed to stage the scene and themselves as victims of a crime they discovered. So they picked up their shells, hid the shotguns in the trunk of their car, and waited a while to establish an alibi. They then dialed 911 with trembling fingers. At 11:47 p.m., a call came into Beverly Hills police from a hysterical Lyle Menendez. On the recorded 911 call, Lyle's voice can be heard gasping and sobbing. "Someone killed my parents." The operator struggled to get details as Lyle cried, claiming he and his brother had returned home from a movie to find their mother and father brutally slain. Within minutes, squad cars swarmed the upscale neighborhood. Officers arrived to a ghastly scene in the den and two distraught young men outside. Erik was found on the lawn, doubled over and wailing uncontrollably, while Lyle howled and pressed a hand to his head as if in agony. Biography. To the responding police, the brothers appeared genuinely devastated. The brutality of the murders, their parents had been shot point blank with shotguns, initially suggested a possible mob hit or revenge killing, given Joe's high-profile business dealings. In fact, Lyle and Erik immediately floated the idea that their parents had enemies. Unknown intruders must have done this. Wikipedia. Org. The Beverly Hills Police, more accustomed to investigating burglaries and Hollywood peccadillos than double homicides, treated the grieving sons gently that night, not suspecting them as perpetrators. In the weeks after the funerals, Lyle and Erik attempted to return to a semblance of normal life, or what seemed like normal for two wealthy young men who had suddenly inherited a fortune. To outside observers, their behavior was bizarre. Rather than being paralyzed by fear or mourning, the brothers began a lavish spending spree, almost immediately after their parents' death. Sad news. Joe's estate was worth an estimated $14 million, and the Menendez brothers acted like lottery winners rather than bereaved sons. In the span of only 6 months, they spent around $700,000 of their parents' money. Biography. Lyle bought himself a Rolex watch and a brand new Porsche, and he even invested in a trendy restaurant in Princeton, where he had been living prior to the murders. Biography. Erik, for his part, hired a full-time tennis coach for $50,000 and treated himself to a Jeep Wrangler and an expensive line of personal luxuries. Biography. They took trips overseas, dined at upscale restaurants, and indulged every whim. Such carefree indulgence, so soon after a double homicide, struck investigators as deeply suspicious. Police grew suspicious of the brothers' spendthrift ways and other odd behaviors, like their move to hire a computer expert to remove traces of a recently updated will that had disinherited Themen. Wikipedia. Org. Little by little, what initially looked like shock or coping began to look to detectives more like guilty exuberance. Throughout the fall of 1989, detectives quietly began piecing together a case, but hard evidence was scarce. The brothers had not been arrested, and publicly they still posed as mourning sons. However, inside Erik Menendez, guilt and anxiety were mounting. The burden of what they had done weighed heavily on the more sensitive younger brother. unable to sleep and racked with remorse. Erik eventually sought solace the only way he knew how, by confiding in someone. That someone was Dr. Jerome Oziel, a psychologist whom Erik had seen earlier in his life. Only weeks after the murders, Dr. Oziel reached out to Erik, offering counseling in this time of grief biography. In sessions that stretched over the end of 1989, Erik's composure cracked. He confessed to the killings during a therapy session, pouring out the truth of how he and Lyle had executed their parents' biography. Crucially, Dr. Oziel invited Lyle to a subsequent session and managed to tape record both brothers describing the crime in detail biography. Erik tearfully said, he participated to end the years of misery for his family, to put his mother out of her misery, and to free themselves from their father's tyranny biography. Lyle too admitted his role unequivocally on tape. This breach of the brothers' secret would prove their undoing. Dr. Oziel himself did not go directly to the police, constrained by doctor-patient confidentiality, but he confided in his mistress, a woman named Judalon Smith. In an ironic twist of fate, Smith and Oziel had a falling out. She later described him as manipulative and abusive towards her biography. Angry and fearing for her own safety after an altercation with Oziel, Judalon Smith contacted the Beverly Hills police in early 1990. She revealed that the Menendez brothers had confessed to their parents' murder, and that taped recordings existed biography. Armed with this explosive information, a literal smoking gun in the form of audio tapes, investigators moved quickly. On March 8, 1990, Lyle Menendez was arrested at home, just over 6 months after the killings biography. Erik, who was in Israel at a tennis tournament when he learned of Lyle's arrest, quickly flew back to the US. He surrendered to police at Los Angeles International Airport on March 11, 1999 biography. The brothers were charged with first-degree murder for the brutal slaying of Joe and Kitty. Wikipedia.org. Almost overnight, Lyle and Erik went from rich young socialites to infamous accused killers. Their arrest shocked those who knew them. Friends and extended family struggled to reconcile the image of the polite, somewhat shy Menendez boys with the savage crime. The Menendez case now moved into the courts, and the salacious details were about to spill into the public realm. Yet even as the legal machinery began turning, a deeper story was waiting to be told, one of why this happened. The answer, according to the brothers, lay buried in years of trauma that the world was only beginning to discover. The tragedy of the aftermath was not only that Lyle and Erik's freedom was lost the moment they pulled those triggers, but also that the underlying pain had never been addressed until it was far too late. As Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, might have warned them, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Members, Cogwa.org. Their parents' abuses and failures were what happened to them. The way the brothers reacted, with secrecy, then violence, would come to define their lives forever. Erik left and Lyle Menendez sit on the steps of their Beverly Hills home in late 1989, just months after the murders. Outwardly, they appeared relaxed, but inwardly, they were grappling with the violent secret of what they had done. Images. Chapter 40 Truth and Lies in the Courtroom. By 1993, the Menendez brothers had been behind bars for 3 years awaiting trial, and their case had become a national sensation. Americans were riveted by the spectacle. Two wealthy, clean-cut brothers accused of the cold-blooded shotgun murder of their own parents. When the trial finally began in July 1993, it was broadcast on court TV. One of the first major cases in the era of televised trials. What unfolded in that Los Angeles courtroom was as gripping and surreal as a Hollywood script, except it was all tragically real. The defense, led by famed attorney Leslie Abramson, representing Erik, and co-counsel Jill Lansing for Lyle, did not try to deny that the brothers pulled the triggers. The question was why. In a stunning opening statement, the defense claimed that Lyle and Erik had killed Joe and Kitty Menendez in self-defense, not out of greed or malice. In Wikipedia.org. Abramson painted a nightmarish picture of life inside the Menendez home. She asserted that the brothers had endured years of unspeakable abuse at the hands of their father, and, to a lesser extent, their mother. Joe's, she said, was not just a harsh taskmaster but a depraved sexual predator. According to the defense, Joe's had been molesting Lyle from the ages of 6 to 8, and Erik from age 6 until as recently as 18, right up to the year of the murders. Biography. The courtroom and TV audience were stunned as details of the alleged sexual abuse emerged. The brothers described, in graphic and tearful testimony, how their father forced himself on them, how they lived in terror and shame, and how Kitty did nothing to stop it. Lyle, now in his mid-20s, broke down on the stand as he recounted confronting Joe's just days before the killings. He claimed he threatened to expose his father's abuse of Erik, and that Joe's reaction was a chilling, angry threat to kill them both if they ever spoke out. Biography. In the brothers' view, that confrontation was the final trigger. They truly believed that they would be murdered by their parents to ensure their silence. Under this narrative, the night of August 20, 1989, was a preemptive strike born of terror. Kitty, the defense argued, had been descending into addiction and despair, allegedly becoming volatile and abusive herself, and the boys felt she was complicit or unable to protect them. The defense portrayed Kitty as emotionally unstable, a drunk, a pill popper, and a useless mother, devastated by Joe's infidelities. Biography. Suggesting that Kitty knew of the abuse and yet hurled cruel comments at her sons, exacerbating their trauma. In short, the defense contended that Lyle and Erik were victims of long-term parental torture who struck back in a desperate bid to save their own lives. The prosecution, led by Los Angeles Deputy Pamela Bozanich and later David Kahn in the retrial, offered a starkly different story. According to prosecutors, Lyle and Erik Menendez were not fearful sons, but calculating murderers motivated by greed. The state contended that there was no credible evidence of any sexual abuse, that it was an elaborate lie concocted to justify an atrocity. Wikipedia. They argued the brothers killed Joe's and Kitty because the boys had been spoiled by wealth and had grown to hate their parents' discipline. In the summer of 1989, Joe's had threatened to cut back financial support due to the brothers' bad behavior. Both had gotten into trouble. Lyle was disciplined in college for plagiarism, Erik for minor burglaries. Facing the possibility of lost status and riches, the prosecution said, the brothers plotted to murder their parents and inherit the estate. They pointed to the spending spree, the luxury cars, watches, trips as evidence of a monetary motive. News. Even more damning, investigators found that just days after the murders, Lyle had begun to delete his father's will from the family computer, apparently unaware that a hard copy existed in Wikipedia. That will had reportedly reduced the brothers' inheritance due to their misbehavior. By killing their parents, the prosecution argued, the Menendez brothers stood to gain everything. Prosecutors labeled the abuse claims as a smokescreen, asserting that Lyle and Erik could not produce any solid evidence of molestation, and that no one outside the immediate family had ever suspected such horrific abuse while Joe's and Kitty were alive. In their eyes, the Menendez brothers were villains, not victims, narcissists who chose the path of ultimate selfishness by murdering the very people who gave them life. Over the course of the first trial, both sides presented their case. The nation watched transfixed as the brothers themselves testified about the alleged sexual abuse in graphic detail. Weeping on the stand, psychologists for the defense explained how years of trauma could lead to a form of learned helplessness and a genuine belief that killing was the only escape. The prosecution vigorously cross-examined, highlighting inconsistencies and suggesting the brothers were acting out a script of lies. Family members were split. Some relatives supported the boys' claims. A cousin named Diane later testified that Lyle had confided in her about the abuse when he was a child, lending some credence to their story. Biography. While others believed the abuse allegations were untrue and cruelly slanderous to Joe's and Kitty's memory, the public too was divided. Many could not fathom that affluent young men would slaughter their parents unless pushed beyond normal limits, while others cynically viewed the abuse story as the ultimate manipulation of a legal system prone to sympathize with victims. After a dramatic trial lasting 6 months, the first Menendez jury, actually 2 juries, one for each brother, could not reach a verdict. Biography. The panels were deadlocked, split between those leaning toward manslaughter, signifying they believed the brothers acted out of genuine fear, and those favoring murder convictions. Consequently, in January 1994, the judge declared mistrials. This outcome showed how effective the emotional testimony had been. At least some jurors found the brothers' claims believable enough to hesitate in convicting them of murder. Immediately, the Los Angeles County District Attorney announced the brothers would be retried. The second trial in 1995 was markedly different. By then, the Menendez case had lost some of its novelty, and Judge Stanley Weisberg made two crucial rulings. He banned cameras from the courtroom, denying the defense the advantage of public sympathy through televised testimony, and severely limited the admissible evidence of abuse, ruling much of it as unproven or hearsay biography. The brothers could still claim abuse, but without the same visceral impact of the first trial's exhaustive testimonies. The Jodelon Smith, the psychologist's mistress, who had tipped off police, even came forward to testify for the defense in the second trial. She strangely claimed Dr. Oziel had coerced the brothers into confessing, a gambit to undermine the tape's biography. But this maneuver fell flat and likely damaged the defense's credibility. In the second trial, the jury was left with a far more straightforward case. Two young men had undeniably executed their parents, and the imperfect self-defense theory was harder to substantiate with less supporting evidence allowed. In March 1996, Lyle and Erik Menendez were convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder each. Biography. The special circumstances, lying in wait and multiple victims, meant that they faced the possibility of the death penalty. Wikipedia.org. However, the prosecution had not explicitly sought execution, and in the penalty phase the jury spared them. The brothers were sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, each receiving 2 consecutive life terms in July 1996. Biography. They were 28 and 25 years old respectively, effectively destined to spend the rest of their lives behind bars. As the courtroom saga ended, many felt justice had been served, others felt an uncomfortable sense that there was more nuance to the case than the verdicts reflected. Years later, some evidence would emerge to bolster the brothers' abuse claims. For instance, that cousin's testimony to ABC News and a rediscovered letter from Erik detailing abusing news. As well as a former member of the boy band Menudo alleging Jose Menendez had molested him as well. News. Society's understanding of sexual abuse also grew in the decades after the trial, leading some to view the case in a more sympathetic light. Biography. But regardless of public opinion shifts, the legal outcome was final. Lyle and Erik Menendez were officially branded parricides and sent to separate maximum security prisons to live out their days. When the iron cell doors clanged shut on the Menendez brothers, one tragedy had compounded another. If the brothers had truly been lifelong victims of horrific abuse, they were now victims of their own violent reaction to it, trading one kind of prison for another. If they had lied about the abuse, then they were living the consequences of monstrous greed. In either scenario, everyone lost. Jose and Kitty were dead, their reputations in tatters. Lyle and Erik were alive, but essentially condemned to slow deaths in prison. The Menendez family line, once seemingly so full of promise, had destroyed itself from within. It is here that one cannot help but reflect on an ancient moral insight, voiced by the Stoic emperor, Marcus Aurelius. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injustice. Wise daily. In choosing to kill, the Menendez brothers became exactly what they said they feared: killers. Had they found a way to break the cycle of harm instead of mirroring it, their story would not have ended in such ruin. Chapter 50 Reflections. Could virtue have averted tragedy? The Menendez case leaves us with a haunting question. Could this tragedy have been avoided? Hindsight is imperfect, but it offers the opportunity to learn. When we examine the story of Lyle and Erik Menendez through the lens of philosophy and human morality, we find multiple junctures where a different choice, rooted in emotional intelligence, virtue might have led to a vastly different outcome. This is not to pass simple judgment on complex human beings, but to seek understanding in the hope of preventing future tragedies of this kind. One glaring aspect of the Menendez family saga is the total failure of communication and trust. There were countless missed opportunities for honesty and help. The brothers might have confided in a relative, a teacher, or a friend about the abuse, if it was occurring. Kitty might have confronted her husband, or sought help for her sons, Joe might have recognized the harm of his ways and reformed. Instead, everyone stayed silent in misery. The Stoic philosophers often emphasized the importance of self-inquiry and understanding one's own mind. Had there been self-inquiry in this family, moments of honest reflection, someone might have acknowledged the powder keg of emotions building up. Instead, denial prevailed. The brothers were emotionally lost, unable to calmly assess their situation. They lacked what the Stoics called lates, mastery of the self. Lao Tzu taught, mastering others is strength, mastering yourself is true power. Harinam. In the Menendez home, Joe had mastered and controlled others through fear, but neither he nor his sons had mastered themselves. True power, the kind that could have saved them, would have been the strength to face their pain without letting it dictate destructive action. Emotional control is another virtue that, tragically, was absent at the critical moment. The boys' pent-up fear and rage exploded in that living room in a way that can never be undone. Marcus Aurelius, himself no stranger to pressure and anger, wrote extensively about controlling one's temper. Whenever you are about to find fault with someone, he wrote, ask yourself first, what fault of mine most nearly resembles the one I am about to criticize? Medium. Comedium. If Lyle and Erik had paused to examine their own fury and desperation, might they have sought another solution? It's hard to say. They were young, traumatized, and felt cornered, but the Stoics would remind them that no matter how great the provocation, we remain responsible for our own choices. Even if every accusation of abuse was true, killing was not the only path available. Epictetus famously taught that we should not blame outward events, but rather look to our own reactions. It is not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Members, Cogwa, or what happened to Lyle and Erik may have been heinous and deserving of outrage, but how they reacted to their pain became its own calamity. By reacting with violence, they allowed their father's sins, real or perceived, to spawn new sins of their own. In effect, they surrendered control over their own fates to the very anger and fear their father had instilled in them. Imagine if, instead, these young men had possessed the Stoic virtue of courage tempered by wisdom, the courage to endure suffering a bit longer, and the wisdom to seek a non-violent escape. They could have run away from home, or gone to the police with their abuse allegations, or simply confronted their parents without guns in hand. Any of those paths, however hard, might have ended with everyone alive and the possibility of healing. The ancient Stoics spoke often of endurance. If you are distressed by anything external, Marcus wrote, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment. In a similar vein, Epictetus counseled to accept what we cannot change, and focus on what we can. Seek not to have events happen as you want them to, but instead want them to happen as they do happen, and your life will go well. Satindademan. This Stoic acceptance doesn't mean one should tolerate abuse. Rather, it means recognizing what is and isn't in one's control. Lyle and Erik could not control having Joe as their father, nor undo whatever he might have done to them in childhood. But they could control how they dealt with that trauma in the present. They did not have to confront him alone. They did not have to believe his power over them was absolute. That belief, that feeling of being trapped, was perhaps an illusion. By accepting that they could not change the past, or Joe's personality, but could change their own future actions, they might have chosen flight over fight, law over lawlessness. It's important, too, to consider the role of discipline and reason. In a crisis, our passions surge and can drown out the voice of reason. Descartes, a philosopher of rationalism, once wrote of his personal code to conquer myself rather than fortune, and change my desires rather than the order of the world. Persuading myself that, except our own thoughts, there is nothing absolutely in our power. Literature page. What did Descartes mean by this? He meant that we cannot control external events of fortune, but we can discipline ourselves, our thoughts and desires, to cope with those events. In the Menendez case, neither the parents nor the sons managed to conquer themselves. Joe apparently did not master his darker impulses and tyrannical temperament. Kitty did not conquer her despair, and ultimately Lyle and Erik did not master their fear. They tried instead to change the order of their world by force, literally by eliminating their parents. This is the opposite of the discipline Descartes and the Stoics advocated. The result was ruinous. Descartes also acknowledged that such inner mastery is not easy. There is need of prolonged discipline and frequently repeated meditation to accustom the mind to view all objects in this light. Literature page. In other words, it takes practice and reflection to respond to great pain with patience and wisdom. Lyle and Erik had never been taught or encouraged to practice that kind of discipline. One might say they were emotionally ill, equipped to deal with the extraordinary situation they perceived themselves to be in. This is where society and community failed them as well. If just one person had noticed their plight and intervened with support, the outcome might have changed. Their tragedy underlines why emotional education and mental health support are so crucial, especially for the young and vulnerable. The Menendez case also highlights how trauma can become a generational curse if not addressed. We don't know much about José Menendez's own upbringing, whether he, as a Cuban immigrant, faced childhood traumas or harsh discipline that he then passed on. But we do see clearly that the unresolved trauma of the brothers led them to inflict trauma on others, and themselves. It's a stark illustration of a concept found in many philosophies, the cycle of suffering. Violence begets violence. In the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu offers a gentle warning. For every force, there is a counterforce. Violence, even well-intentioned, always rebounds upon oneself. Content catnip. The brothers may have convinced themselves that killing their father was a well-intentioned act, in their minds, delivering their family from abuse. But that violence rebounded terribly. They ended up shackled by the very violence they unleashed, the karmic echo of taking lives. The brothers' own lives, while not physically ended, were effectively destroyed, spent in the confinement of prison, and the endless replaying of that fateful night. Finally, consider the virtue of compassion, or empathy, the ability to put oneself in another's place. Had any member of the Menendez family been able to fully empathize with another, things might have been different. If Jose had felt compassion for his sons' suffering, rather than perhaps seeing them as extensions of his ego to be controlled, he might have broken his pattern of abuse. If Kitty had truly acknowledged the pain her boys were in, perhaps she would have found the strength to stand up to Jose or get help, rather than self-medicating with pills and alcohol. And if Lyle and Erik, even in their justifiable anger, had felt a twinge of empathy in the moment, before pulling those triggers, seeing their parents, not as monsters, but as fallible human beings, maybe they would have hesitated. That hesitation could have opened the door to a different solution. The Stoics held rational compassion in high regard. They believed in confronting wrongdoing, but with the aim of understanding and correcting, not simply punishing. Marcus Aurelius advised himself in Meditations to meet others' misdeeds with the reminder that all people do wrong out of ignorance, and that one should respond with teaching, not hatred, wherever possible a medium. If the brothers felt they were wronged, the Stoic approach would implore try every option to educate or escape before resorting to revenge. Sadly, by the time they considered escape, they chose bullets over words. In sum, the Menendez brothers saga is a dark illustration of what can happen when virtue is absent in a crucible of human conflict. No emotional control, no open self-reflection, no acceptance of alternatives, no discipline of impulses. The result was a moral and human catastrophe. And yet, their story, as heartbreaking as it is, can serve as an enduring lesson. It implores us to ask, how do we confront our own pain and conflict? When we feel cornered by life, maybe not as extremely as the Menendez brothers felt, but in our own trials, do we lash out and let rage take the lead? Or do we pause and seek a wiser path? We may not face the same circumstances, but at some point we all confront anger, betrayal, or desperation. In those moments, will we be ruled by passion or guided by principle? Chapter 6c, Confronting Pain Without Becoming Destroyer. The tale of the Menendez brothers is ultimately a cautionary one, etched in blood and sorrow. It stands as a profound example of how unchecked pain can turn victims into perpetrators, and how the failure to confront suffering with wisdom can multiply that suffering tenfold. As we close this chapter on their story, we are left with a solemn moral reflection relevant to every one of us. Life will confront us with pain, be it abuse, loss, injustice, or inner turmoil. These brothers experienced pain in their home that they felt was unbearable and inescapable. In the face of their agony, they chose to respond with destruction. In doing so, they crossed a line that can never be uncrossed, transforming their own pain into pain inflicted on others. This is a trap as ancient as humanity itself, the temptation to answer hurt with hurt, to meet fire with fire. But as the Greek philosopher Epictetus might remind us, no matter how fierce the fire around us, we retain the freedom to decide whether to feed it or extinguish it. The Menendez brothers fed the fire until it became an all-consuming blaze that devoured their family. What their story teaches is the paramount importance of breaking the cycle of trauma and rage. We must strive, in our own lives, to confront pain without becoming its slave. That can mean seeking help, speaking out, cultivating patience, or even practicing forgiveness, anything but surrendering to blind fury. It means having the humility to ask for a lifeline when drowning in despair, rather than dragging others down into the depths with us. It means realizing, as Marcus Aurelius wrote, that the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injustice. Wise daily. Come to confront cruelty with character, to meet hatred with integrity, to respond to chaos with self-control. That is how we prevent pain from dictating our destiny. If there is any glimmer of redemption in the Menendez tragedy, it may be in the lessons it leaves for the rest of us. Over 30 years later, Lyle and Erik Menendez remain in prison, now middle-aged men who have spent more years behind bars than they did in freedom. By many accounts, they have tried to better themselves in prison, gaining educations, helping fellow inmates, even expressing remorse. They cannot undo what they did. Just as they could not undo what was done to them in childhood, they are living testaments to the notion that when we fail to master our emotions master us. Each brother has had endless days and nights to reflect on that night in 1989. In their separation, they were not housed in the same prison until decades later. One imagines they had to confront their guilt and grief largely alone in the solitude of a cell. It is a heavy price for a few moments of violent resolution that solved nothing. Mugshots of Lyle Menendez left and Erik Menendez, right, taken in October 2024, after 34 years in prison. Decades of reflection behind bars have visibly aged them, yet they appear calm, perhaps having made some peace with the past. Their case continues to spur debates on trauma and justice. California Department of Corrections, Fox News. Fox News.com. For the rest of us, the Menendez brothers' story is a dramatic mirror that forces us to examine how we deal with our own demons. Do we communicate our hurt, or do we let it fester? Do we seek understanding, or do we hide behind denial? Do we choose the hard road of healing, or the seductive but destructive road of vengeance? The enduring wisdom of the ages, from Stoic philosophers, from sages of all cultures, urges us to choose healing and wisdom. It urges us to pause in the face of fury. It urges us to remember that no matter how deep our suffering, committing injustice will only deepen it. In closing, the Menendez tragedy beckons us to cultivate virtues like empathy, self-control, and courage in our own lives. Let us teach our children and remind ourselves that no pain justifies inflicting pain on others. Let us strive to break the chains of our traumas through dialogue therapy, forgiveness, or escape towards safety, not through bullets or blades. When we feel the temptation of destructive revenge, let us recall the timeless counsel of Marcus Aurelius and choose instead to be better than what threatens to break us. Confronting pain with compassion and reason may not be easy, but it is the path that leads away from ruin. The story of Erik and Lyle Menendez leaves us with a final, somber insight. In the war within one's soul, victory is not achieved by destroying the enemy outside, but by conquering the darkness inside. Each of us will face moments of anger and hurt. In those moments, may we find the strength to hold to virtue. May we remember that by mastering ourselves, we can endure and overcome any hardship, and in doing so, prevent the birth of a new tragedy. The Menendez brothers chose a path of destruction and became trapped in its aftermath. May we choose a different path, one of understanding, resilience, and love, so that pain can be met with healing and conflict with growth. rather than with more destruction. That is the enduring lesson of this grievous saga, a lesson written in tears and, we hope, not soon forgotten.